Murder News. Murder News.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for another podcast episode / weekly cult meeting. I'm Angelina, and I'm hanging out with my bewitching bestie, Aurora.
Hi, friends. Have you ever noticed how perfect cults always sound before the big twist in the documentary? Us too. And that's what inspired us to start a cult where the only spooky twists are our Wednesday Addams braids. If you've ever wanted to get away from the world with some baby animals and some fellow weirdos and tell murder stories around a roaring campfire, the Monster Commune is for you. To become an official member today, just head over to patreon.com/murdernews so you can get your own flashy title like Deacon of Goats, a bit of murder merch, and exclusive access to our regular patron-only content.
Right at the end of this month, we have an exclusive episode coming out on Patreon about Janie Jones, who you might know from the Clash song, or you might remember us talking about her in the Moore's Murders episode. Find out all about who she is and all the mischief she brought to London starting in the 1950s and 60s in our special video episode.
Ooh.
So, Aurora, how was your week?
It is going well.
Nice.
This week I was chatting with an Oscar winner sound editor, Mac,
Ooh.
who won the Oscar for the movie Dune.
Very fancy.
He's working on the show that my husband's working on. He's so fantastic. I love chatting with him. And he was just asking what my podcast was before this today and said he's going to tune in. And I was like, that's so exciting.
Cool.
And 5 minutes later, I was like, this is terrifying.
Oh, no.
So Mac, if you're listening, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Yeah. Hi, Mac.
And how's your week going?
Pretty great, pretty uneventful, which is great. No news is good news. But tonight I'm going out to see Peaches with a couple friends who don't know each other but will like each other. So that will be fun.
That is amazing.
Excited.
So we have an update about one of the victims of Dorothea Puente, which we covered in an episode a little bit ago, episode 60. And in that episode, we mentioned that we had a hard time finding much information about the victims because the case was a bit older. And also so many news publications at the time really focused on Dorothea and didn't touch much on the victims. So it was just a little hard to find some stuff about them. And we were so pleased to hear from the granddaughter of Dorothy Miller, who I believe was the 7th victim of Dorothea, and she was just 65 years old at the time of the murder. Dorothy's granddaughter, Amy, reminded us that while Dorothea attempted to select victims that she believed no one cared about, she was really wrong about that. Dorothy was very loved by her family, and they had been looking for her and were very worried when she went missing. It was just a different time in the 80s without cell phones, debit cards, and other systems we now have to make it easier to track a loved one who might have just kind of accidentally disappeared and wasn't taking off on purpose. So here's a comment we received from Amy about her grandma, and thank you so much for giving us permission to use this as well. So Amy said, "My grandmother was Dorothy Miller, one of the victims of Dorothea. I was actually in a 2-part Oxygen doc on Murders at the Boarding House, talking about my beautiful grandma and explaining that contrary to popular belief, my grandma had a family that loved her and looked for her. Only we looked in Texas where she lived. We had no clue she'd run off to California until my dad got the phone call."
She went on to say, "My grandma was beautiful. She had 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, which is my dad. She served in World War II. She lived with us for a long time due to a bad fall she had. My dad had her come live with us, but she did suffer from traumatic brain injury, so it changed her personality a lot and her medical needs. So she wanted to live at an assisted living facility maybe 3 miles from our home. We would go visit her and pick her up for holidays, and then one day she just vanished. She took off, and no one knew where she was. We now know she had left with her little boyfriend from the facility, and they went to California. They didn't have money or a place to live, so a social worker placed her at the boarding house where she was murdered for a Social Security check that was roughly $1,000 a month. We brought her ashes back home to Texas. My grandma had always told my dad she didn't want to be cremated, but unfortunately, by the time they found her body, there wasn't much left because she was one of the first victims. Grandma had her issues, but we all loved her and we miss her. She probably would have just given her money to that evil woman. She certainly didn't deserve to die for it.
So, Amy, thank you so much for that update. We're definitely going to go check out that Oxygen show that you were on too. Like, that's so cool that Oxygen did reach out to you for that. And we just really appreciate you, reaching out to us. Like, it really meant a lot to us. And we definitely want to make sure that we honor Dorothy because she sounds so amazing.
Yeah.
So before we dig into today's story, let's take a look at some of the true crime stories that made headlines this week.
Just 10 days after the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, which claimed the lives of 10, there has been another shooting in an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. On Tuesday, 18-year-old Salvador Rolando Ramos opened fire with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and a handgun, killing 19 children, all under the age of 10, and 2 adults at Robb Elementary School. It's believed Salvador also shot his grandmother before driving to the school for the attack. This has been the deadliest shooting since Sandy Hook in 2012. The students of Robb Elementary School were in their final week of classes before summer break and had been celebrating with themes like Tuesday's Footloose and Fancy, where the kids got to dress up in fun footwear and fancy outfits.
Ooh, this is it's
devastating.
Just so devastating.
Anything involving little kids like that, like 19 children under the age of 10, that's horrific. That's, when I first heard it, I was like, wow, that's the one thing I've heard to maybe top Sandy Hook, which was also horrifying. Yeah, just, ugh.
It's so sad. The kids were so young. Like, it's just, oh God, like it has to stop. Like, it's just too heartbreaking. So scary.
Honestly, I was talking to a friend who told me about this story, actually, who commented, don't those schools in Texas have armed guards to respond to shootings? And they do, but I think Sandy Hook did as well, and they were afraid of the situation. They weren't ready to actually stand up to it. And the thing is, you can't block a shooting with more guns. That's really not how it works. That's how they always want to approach it. But the best way is less guns, less access to guns. Like none of these kids and, people struggling with mental illness or just randoms should have access to guns so easily to carry out things like this. Yeah.
No. Well, on Friday, 16-year-old Daniel Gore was charged with the death of Milana Lee, a 13-year-old who was missing and was later found dead near her home. Milana has been described by her family and friends since her death as a caring and fun young girl. She was reported missing by her mother on May 9th, a day after she was last seen. The next day, her body was found in a stream by Westside Linear Park on the southern border of Oregon near her house. The Washington County Medical Examiner determined her death to be a homicide, and from community tips and discussions, they arrested Daniel for a connection.
We'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
We are Wendy and Beth, and we host the podcast Fruit Loop Serial Killers of Color. Tell the people about the show, Wendy.
Well, happy to. As you might have guessed by now, our show focuses on serial killers of color. We decided to make this the focus of our show because most of the podcasts that we listen to focused on whole white serial killers, also male, cisgender, hetero serial killers. And we thought the space could use a little spice, a little diversity.
Yeah, and we believe that the victim stories are important. Many of the victims are also BIPOC folks, and the media just doesn't focus on these people.
We also get plenty of opportunities to discuss race relations, systemic oppression, policing, history, and culture. We learn something new every day, and we hope that you do too.
Join us as we tell the fascinating stories of these crimes that often go untold by the mainstream media. Subscribe or download Fruit Loop Serial Killers of Color now on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Look alive, y'all. It's crazy out there.
And we're back. Before we dig in, we want to offer a quick disclaimer. Though we joke about forming a true crime cult, that is not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, and we want you to know that we take the cases we're discussing very seriously.
We want to deliver each story with the utmost respect to victims and anyone involved. If you feel we've missed the mark, you don't like our tone, Or if you notice we've gotten any details wrong, let us know with a quick email to murdermurdernews@gmail.com and we'll make it right.
We have a specific trigger warning for this episode for graphic depictions of violence. If you're particularly sensitive to that, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
We're going to really travel back in time today for a historical crime that took place over 100 years ago this week on May 23rd, 1918. There's a lot of lore surrounding the Axeman of New Orleans, and many historians believe his first victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, though some believe his attacks could have started as early as 1910, that the killer was just ramping up his MO in the same way many serial killers do, refining his crimes over time. Nonetheless, the Axeman became feared throughout New Orleans for his brutal crimes, inspiring songs, jazz nights, and even a character on American Horror Story. He would mostly target Italian immigrants who owned grocery stores, use a screwdriver to chisel a panel into the back door of their home to break in, and then using the family's own axe, attack them in their sleep. Were these crimes racially motivated by a serial killer? Is it possible these attacks were carried out by the mafia? Or were axe-related crimes just incredibly common during a time when most families in the U.S. had to keep a fire going to keep warm at home? Our sources for this week include The Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story, a book by Miriam C. Davis, Medium, History.com, Wikipedia, and more. For a full list of our sources, check out our show notes. And just a quick note that since this case is quite vintage, we had a hard time finding much information about many of the victims. And of course, you all probably already know we like to take a victim and survivor first approach to how we share stories. So we do apologize for that lack of info.
Between 1884 and 1924, nearly 300,000 Italians, mostly Sicilian, moved to New Orleans. Many of them moved to the French Quarter, earning the neighborhood the nickname Little Palermo. The mass migration started after the Civil War, when freed men and women were allowed to leave the area in search of higher wages, which led to a shortage in workers, particularly at sugarcane fields. At the time, Sicily was in a state of unrest, so the Louisiana Labor Bureau sought to recruit Italians to move to New Orleans and the surrounding areas. Many Italians moved there to seek farm work and a better life, and unfortunately, they were met with hostility and racism, as Americans proved time and time again to be the worst. They were treated like criminals, and the local Louisianans believed they were all in the mafia and that their religion and food was dangerous. Nonetheless, in 1880, it's estimated that about 7% of grocery stores in New Orleans were owned by Italians, but by 1920, they owned about half of the groceries in the area. As we alluded to already, there were a shocking number of axe attacks in New Orleans during this era, and according to Miriam C. Davis's book, a doctor from the time attributed this largely to the availability of axes in homes. Everyone still had fireplaces, everyone had an axe, and if a dispute got heated, it was an easy weapon of choice. A higher number of axe attacks at the time would have made it harder for police to see a pattern if there was an axe-wielding serial killer roaming the streets. When we also take into consideration that local police departments did not always communicate and cooperate with other departments about crimes that might be related, the term serial killer hadn't been invented yet, and CODIS wouldn't exist until 1990. Most historians credit a total of 12 attacks to the Axeman between May of 1918 and October of 1919. But several of those attacks were likely personal and not the work of a random killer. And there are attacks that started in 1910 that sound so similar to the attacks during 1918 and 1919 that it's hard to believe that they weren't the work of the Axeman if we assume the other attacks are, in fact, connected.
On August 13th, 1910, at 3 a.m., 29-year-old Harriet Crotty was woken in her sleep to a shadowy figure standing over her bed with a meat cleaver. As Harriet came to, the man demanded money from her, and she soon realized the meat cleaver was covered in the blood of her husband, 40-year-old August. Her husband had already been struck with the cleaver and was lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. She gave the man the money that she kept in a box under her pillow, and he ran off with the $8, which would have been just over $200 at the time, then grabbed the family's caged mockingbird on the way out. Police were called to the scene and discovered the robber had used a shoe pin to break into the kitchen door. August was taken to Charity Hospital, where he ultimately survived his injuries. Harriet described her attacker as being in his mid-30s, 5'6", with broad shoulders, clean-shaven, dark hair, and wearing a worker shirt, dark pants, and a black derby hat. The attacker was never caught, and though the couple were Italian grocers attacked in their sleep, many don't believe the Crutis were attacked by the Axemen.
On September 20th, 1910, at 1:45 a.m., another Italian couple owning a grocery were attacked in their sleep. 36-year-old Concetta Rizzetto awoke to a meat axe smashing the side of her face, breaking her cheekbone. The man continuously hit her face with the axe as she tried to roll away, with her neck slashed as a result of the struggle. The attacker moved to the other side of the couple's bed, hitting 42-year-old Joseph in the face twice, cutting through the cartilage of his nose. The assailant dropped the meat axe in their bedroom and took nothing with him. Upon investigating, the police believe the attacker broke in through an unlocked window in the kitchen. The attacker brought the meat axe, which is essentially a heavier version of a meat cleaver, with him to the Rizzetto house, but it had actually been reported stolen from a butcher's stall several weeks earlier. Police also found the attacker's footprints in the Rizzetto's yard, which was an indicator to them that he had likely taken off his shoes to prowl through their house undetected. Like Auguste Crudy, the Rizzettos were both taken to Charity Hospital, and they both survived.
On June 26, 1911, there was another attack in the home of an Italian grocer about a mile away from the Rizzetto home. 16-year-old Mary Davi and her 26-year-old husband Joe were expecting their first child together. Mary awoke late that night to a man going through their wardrobe. She tried to wake Joe to alert him to the intruder, but the man, now aware she was awake, demanded to know where the money was. Frozen in fear, Mary didn't answer, and the man hit her over the head. Accounts vary as to what he used to hit her. The one report said it was a ceramic mug, but nonetheless, she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she was bleeding from the head, and her husband was lying beside her with his head brutally beaten with visible wounds. Doctors believe Joe had been beaten with a cleaver, and he died of his injuries 2 days later. Mary was able to provide a description of her attacker as just under 6 feet tall, white, clean-shaven, wearing workman's clothes, and speaking with a neutral American accent. Mary commented on how silent the attacker had moved through the room, which made police wonder if the man had been barefoot. The Davis had been very successful as grocers at a young age, and this was the first time the police suspected that the Cleaver of New Orleans might have an issue with Italian immigrants who soon to be making a go of things in the U.S.
After the Davi attack, things seemed to calm down. Keep in mind, these three crimes do all seem to be related, but they're not necessarily considered to have been perpetrated by the Axeman. Whatever the case, there seemed to be no similar break-ins for 6 years. On December 22nd, 1917, around 3 a.m., Anna Andolina woke to find an intruder standing over her sleeping husband, Epifanio, with a hatchet and revolver. The man realized Anna was staring, and he turned the gun to her, warning her to stay quiet. He then hit her husband 4 or 5 times in the head with the hatchet before running out of the room. Anna began screaming, trying to warn her children of the assailant. At that point, their 16-year-old daughter awoke, and Anna called for her to get the younger children to safety. The man went into the room where 14-year-old John and 13-year-old Salvador slept and hit John in the head with the axe and Salvador in the arm with his pistol. He left the house through the kitchen, dropping the hatchet on the floor as he made his escape. Upon investigating, police learned that the attacker had chiseled a panel through the back door. Like the other attacks, the Andolinas were Italian immigrants from Sicily, and they had owned their grocery for 5 years. Epifanio and his 2 sons all survived the brutal attack.
This brings us up to this week in history and the first recognized attack of the Axeman of New Orleans. On May 23, 1918, 28-year-old Andrew Maggio had been out late drinking. He shared a small home with his brother, 40-year-old Joseph, and his wife, Catherine. Joseph was the oldest of the 4 Maggio brothers and was the first in his family to migrate to the U.S. from Italy. He opened a grocery store and then sent for the rest of his family to join him in New Orleans. Andrew was the youngest of the Maggio boys and lived with his brother in a little home in the back of Joseph's grocery. Andrew ran a nearby barbershop and had recently been a little stressed about potentially being drafted in World War II. He'd been out drinking until late that night and was in a deep, deep sleep. He woke around 4:30 a.m. to the sound of Joseph's groaning through their shared wall in the home. Andrew wasn't sure what he heard or if he had heard anything at all, but felt like something wasn't right. He tried knocking on the wall, hoping to get a response, but there was just silence on the other end.
Andrew continued to have a feeling something was wrong, but he didn't feel comfortable just barging into Joseph's room where he slept with his wife. Andrew went to get his older brother, 36-year-old Jacob, who lived nearby and had a shoe repair shop. The two came back into the house through the kitchen door in the back and noticed a panel had been chiseled. Jacob knocked on Joseph's bedroom door, and there was again no answer. He opened the door to find both Joseph and Catherine had been attacked. Joseph was lying on the side of the bed with his feet hanging onto the ground. Catherine lay on the floor at Joseph's feet, sprawled on her back with a gaping wound on the right side of her neck. Both had wounds to their heads and neck and were covered in blood. Catherine was already dead when the two brothers arrived, but Joseph was clinging on to life. Joseph was taken to Charity Hospital, but died from his injuries just a few hours later.
Police found the Maggios' own axe covered in blood in their bathtub. Autopsy showed that they both had their throats cut with a razor, and Joseph was hit twice with the axe, fracturing his skull with cuts to his face and neck. Catherine had nearly been decapitated, but had not sustained injuries to her head from the axe. She also had defensive wounds to her hands and cuts to her face and shoulder. A small safe in their bedroom had been unlocked, and $50 had been taken from a box in the safe. Valuable jewelry had also been found inside, but had not been removed. The attacker had gone through their dresser drawers, but nothing seemed to be missing. The second murder weapon, a black and yellow straight razor, had been found sticking out of a trellis not far from the Maggios. The blade was covered in blood. Papers reported that a message had been written in chalk on a sidewalk a block away saying, "Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." However, accounts of the message all varied slightly. It's possible this message was left by the killer, but also possible it was a tasteless joke.
While there hadn't been a viable suspect in any of the other attacks, this time the police quickly identified a person of interest. They found it very suspicious that Andrew had not only slept through the entire attack, but that the Axeman hadn't come after him as well. While investigating the Maggios' home, they found a shirt in Andrew's bedroom with dark spots on it that had since been washed. They also found blood-soaked clothes in Joseph's bedroom, which matched a description of what Andrew had been wearing that night. Someone from Andrew's barbershop also had reported that he had taken a razor blade home from work with him recently. However, all of this evidence was circumstantial, and when picked apart, didn't appear to carry weight. Andrew explained that the shirt they had found with dark spots was from a time he had spilled wine on himself at a wedding. The razor blade he had taken from work appeared to be accounted for in his room, and it made sense that a barber would have razor blades around. And aside from that, there seemed to be no motive for Andrew to kill his brother or his wife. The two seemed to get along well, and his emotional response to losing his brother felt too genuine to detectives. Andrew was released, and the Axeman remained on the loose.
On June 27, 1918, there was yet another axe attack, but this one didn't quite seem to line up with the others. That morning, John Zonka stopped by 60-year-old Louis Levesque's grocery to deliver bread. The shop was shuttered, which was very unusual to John, who decided he would not leave the store without making his delivery. There was no answer at the front of the shop, so John went around to the back where Louis lived with his wife, 29-year-old Harriet. He knocked continuously and then heard footsteps inside. He heard a voice saying, "Come around to the front." The door opened a crack, and John could see Louis inside, disheveled, with blood streaked on his face. John asked if he was okay, and Louis said, "Don't worry about it. There was an accident." John asked if Louis's wife was okay, and Louis said he didn't know, and John should come in and check on her himself. John found Harriet lying in bed, blood-soaked and nearly unconscious. She opened her eyes and said, "I'm cold." John called for an ambulance, and the two were taken to the hospital. Louis had one wound to the head right above his eye, which may have fractured his skull, but was not life-threatening. Harriet's injuries were much more serious. She had several gashes on her arms and chest and had been hit twice on her head, fracturing her skull, causing severe brain trauma. Both survived the attack.
Upon investigating, police found the wooden handle of an ancient axe 5 feet away from the rusty blade on the couple's porch. It appeared that Harriet had been struck so hard that the axe had lost its blade. There was a pool of blood nearby, and bloody footprints led from the porch through the hallway and up to the bed where Harriet had been found. There was also some blood found on Lewis's pillow, but it did not appear this was where he'd been struck. Lewis and Harriet had been sleeping in separate rooms because Lewis's electric fan would keep her up at night, but something wasn't quite adding up about this crime scene. Lewis didn't seem to remember the attack. He said he had awoken to find himself bleeding and his wife badly injured. No jewelry or money had been taken from the home, and there was no sign of forced entry. Harriet, who had more severe injuries, seemed to struggle to make sense of the attack as well. At first, she said a man had attacked her at the store after she told them they didn't sell tobacco. There wasn't any blood in the shop, and the attack had taken place while the shop was closed.
As time went on, Harriet seemed to be holding back information. She soon opened up that maybe her husband was German and could be some sort of spy.
Oh.
Yeah, and this is during World War I, so this is quite significant. So Lewis, after all, was the first victim who was not Italian. He was from Poland, but Harriet started to allude to the idea that she wasn't really sure where Lewis was actually from and had reason to believe he had multiple identities. In fact, the two had met in Florida not long ago and were only pretending to be married. Police began to wonder if this had been the work of the Axeman at all, or if perhaps Harriet had hit Lewis with the axe after a fight and then he got it away from her and attempted to kill her. Or perhaps Lewis had just attacked Harriet and then hit himself with the axe to make it look like the work of the Axeman. Harriet survived her injuries, but half of her face was paralyzed after her facial nerves were badly damaged. As she recovered from the attack, her memory started to come back to her, and she did finally implicate Lewis as the assailant. She told police she had closed up the shop that night and saw Lewis in their home counting the till. She asked him for the money he owed her for working at the shop, and he said, "You'll get your money and more too." The next thing she recalled was being hit with what she described as 1,000 bricks.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm suspicious as to whether that's even accurate because, of course, being hit in the head can do some weird things to you, make you forget things, and then on top of that, like police insinuating things or the community insinuating things can make you believe something that's not even true. So, like, I'm very curious about what the heck went down there.
Yeah. And, it's funny, like when I was reading this chapter in the book and like reading about the story and the fact that they couldn't figure out where Lewis had been hit. There was no pool of blood from him. I had this feeling that like he had set it up to look like the Axeman attack because he'd read about it in the paper. Like he's not Italian. Yeah. And like the book does go into more detail about his temper. He was known for his temper. There's a lot more to do with like the spy stuff. He was actually investigated by the FBI did not exist at this point, but like by like an agency. And he had like all these like weird secrets and identities. And he had like this ex-wife who said he was violent. And I really do feel like he probably hit her with the axe and like maybe they had a fight and like she had hit him first. I don't know. I don't know that much about her, but I do believe that he is the one that hit her with the axe and not like a robber.
I also wonder, especially at that time, how skilled investigators were at sort of finding out whether wounds were self-inflicted, things like that. So
yeah, that's a very good point. But they could not figure out like where he had been hit. And
if anywhere he was bleeding from.
Yeah. And like part of it is interesting because, there's quite a few of these stories where people wake up and they don't know what's happening. And I think that's actually quite common. Like I think back to the time we had Kathy Kleiner on our show, who is a survivor of Ted Bundy. And she had been hit in the head with a log that he had found outside of their sorority house at Chi Omega. And she doesn't remember several of the hits because when you're in that deep of a sleep and you wake up and now you're receiving a traumatic brain injury.
Not to mention you're hit in the head.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you really can sleep that deeply and now you have brain trauma. And as we go on, we'll see that several of these victim or survivors like did not recall the attack or like just woke up and were like, why am I bleeding? Which is terrifying to think as like people
that's such a
sleeping.
weird
Not
thing to
like
think
anybody
about
could like
feeling.
break in and attack you during your sleep when you aren't aware of it for a
You
while.
wake up like, I'm hurt.
Yeah.
What is this? Like, yeah, that's very, very bizarre.
Very scary, but it's possible he could have been attacked and didn't remember it. But the missing link for me is that if he was sleeping in his bed, like he said, like, why isn't there splatter? Why isn't there more blood in his room?
Yeah. And yeah, he acted weird for sure with his friend and everything. So
For sure.
not long after she was released from the hospital, she had to return because her wounds were not healing correctly. She underwent another surgery, which was a success, but died shortly thereafter of meningitis. It appears that Louis was charged with Harriet's murder, but was later acquitted. The attack of Louis and Harriet is usually listed as an Axeman attack, but it seems much more likely to have been domestic violence. On August 5th, 1918, Mary, sometimes called Anna Schneider, was attacked in her room, and many equate her attempted murder to be the work of the Axeman, though it doesn't quite seem to fit the MO. Mary was not Italian and did not own a grocery. She was a 28-year-old mother and was 8 months pregnant at the time. She'd gone to bed that night while her husband worked a night shift at the Pacific Wharf. She was attacked that night and awoke days later at the hospital confused. Fortunately, both Mary and her newborn baby Clara survived, but she had sustained a gash to her scalp and several teeth cracked and broken. Mary had no memory of an intruder, but police believe someone did break in and hit her in the face several times with a lamp. Reports vary, but some say her sister, who shared the cottage with her, heard her scream, and some say her husband came home to find her covered in blood. A small amount of cash, about $7, was missing, and an axe was missing from the family shed and had been dropped in a neighbor's yard. Still, police believed she was not hit with an axe, but rather the lamp in their home.
On August 10th, 1918, the Axeman struck again. 15-year-old Pauline Bruno was having trouble sleeping. By this point, everyone knew about the Axeman, and this was a particularly terrifying time for Italian immigrants and certainly for grocers. Pauline had been born in Louisiana, but her mom and Uncle Joe were from Italy, and her oldest sister, Rosie, ran a grocery store in the front part of their house. Pauline shared a room with her 13-year-old sister, Mary, and their uncle, 60-year-old Joe Romano, lived in the cottage with them. Their mom, Lily, lived on the other side of the cottage with Rosie. Early that morning, around 3 a.m., Pauline awoke to a moan in her uncle's room. Just then, she saw a man standing in her doorway. She screamed and woke her sister Mary, and the man ran off. Joe came out of his room, bleeding from the head, and sat down in a chair. A bloody axe was found on the floor next to his bed, and his room was splattered with blood. Pauline was able to describe the man as tall, heavily built in a dark suit and black hat. She believed he was white, light on his feet, and thought he was wearing rubber soles. Upon investigating, police found 2 boards in an empty lot beside their house, leaning against their fence, which had been used to access their yard. The attacker had taken an axe from a shed in their yard and then crawled into a small window in the back of the cottage. Uncle Joe died a couple hours later after he arrived at the hospital.
On March 9th, 1919, the Axeman appeared to move across the river to the town of Gretna. Charlie Cordemelia had immigrated to New Orleans from Italy and had initially worked as a laborer. He wanted a place of his own, and by 25, he and his wife Rosie had saved enough money to do just that. Rosie was a native Louisianian and had never gone to school, but could read Italian. The two married when she was only 15, and she gave birth to their daughter Mary in 1917. The young couple rented a room and grocery from the Giordano family, an Italian family who had quite a lot of success in the business. Orlando Giordano had leased the shops to the Cordemelias, but at some point he decided he wanted the shop back because his young son Frank needed extra income to marry his fiancée Josie. This caused some tension between the Giordanos and the Cortemelias, and the Cortemelias ended up opening their own store nearby, which did very well. It's said that it took business away from the Giordano store, which may have caused more tension.
In the early hours of March 9th, Rosie awoke to find her husband struggling with a large man with an axe. She saw her husband fall to the ground, and then the man came after her as she struggled to protect 2-year-old Mary from the attacker. She begged the man for their lives, but he hit both her and Mary in the head with the axe. Neighbors heard the struggle and rushed over to help. Charlie was lying on the ground in a pool of blood, and Rosie was cradling the now unresponsive Mary. An ambulance was called from Charity Hospital, and Charlie and Rosie were rushed off. Little Mary was pronounced dead at the scene. Rosie had several gashes to her head and ear with a fracture on the left side. Doctors performed a craniotomy to release pressure on her brain, but they didn't expect her to survive. Rosie did in fact survive, and a few days later, she named her attacker as Orlando Giordano's young son Frank, claiming Orlando was also involved. Charlie denied that it was the Giordanos all along, but the case went to trial. They were found guilty, and Frank was sentenced to hang, and his father was sentenced to life in prison. And yet another twist, a year later, Rosie now said she lied about the Giordanos, and the police had forced her into that claim.
Oh.
Yeah. So with the only evidence against them being Rosie's testimony, the two were then freed, and Charlie and Rosie divorced shortly thereafter. A few days after the Cordemelia attack, a New Orleans newspaper received the following letter from the alleged Axemen.
Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether which surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit, and a fell demon from hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come again and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except perhaps my bloody axe, besmeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way in which they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to amuse not only me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than for them to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think that there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure that your police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know who to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:25 o'clock earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to the people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I've just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for the people. One thing is certain, and that is some of those persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and as it is about time that I've left your homely earth, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or in the realm of fancy. The Axeman.
Whether or not the letter to the paper was from the Axeman or just a jazz-loving prankster, the people of New Orleans took the letter very seriously. It became a local legend that on that Tuesday, jazz filled the night. Dance halls and jazz clubs were at capacity, families played the piano and record players at home, and everyone stayed up late. Many were skeptical of the letter since no insider information about the attacks had been revealed, but it should be noted that no one was murdered that night. Some have claimed the letter could have been a publicity stunt by local jazz musician Joseph John Davila, who wrote the song Don't Scare Me Papa about the Axeman and later ran an ad in the paper for the sheet music. And let's be honest, the letter does seem to have been written by someone with a flair for theatrics, so it's not hard to believe it was written by a musician.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the song was also covered by Squirrel Nut Zippers in 2018. So let's take a listen to it now. On August 10th, 1919, grocer Steve Boca was attacked while sleeping in his home. He woke up to a man standing over him and then lost consciousness. When he came to, his head was bleeding and he ran to a neighbor to get help. Steve survived and police found a panel on his door had been chiseled out.
On September 3rd, 1919, 19-year-old Sarah Lauman was attacked in her home in her sleep. She screamed when she saw the attacker and he ran. Sarah was not Italian or a grocer and lived with her family. She had a head injury, but the doctor didn't believe it was from an axe. A bloody axe was found in her lawn, but Sarah didn't recall her attacker carrying anything in his hands when he fled her room.
On October 27, 1919, there was another attack in what some believe was the Axeman. 36-year-old Mike and Esther Pepitone owned a corner store and had both worked late that day. Esther woke at 1 a.m. to the sound of her husband screaming. She saw two men running away to her children's room, one tall and thin and the other short and broad. Her husband was unconscious and their mattress was covered in blood. Mike had been hit with an object at least 18 times. An iron bar was found on a chair near the bed. He was rushed to the hospital but died 2 hours later. The assailants had entered their home by breaking a window. Investigators at the time did not believe this was an act by the Axemen, but rather a retaliation for a mob attack from 1910 involving Peter Pepitone, Mike's father. Peter, also an Italian grocer, shot mafioso Paul Di Cristina in his shop with a shotgun. Peter swore that his son Mike was not involved, but Di Cristina's associates didn't buy it, and police believe this was a revenge hit.
Those are the victims believed to be connected with the Axeman of New Orleans, but let's talk a bit about the suspects. As you can guess, no one has been officially charged with the crimes, and there's plenty of speculation that there wasn't just one Axeman. As we mentioned, there is a potential connection to the Di Cristina murder of 1910, and it seems that Italian grocers might have been on the radar for the mob at that time as a result. It's also possible that these specific grocers were being blackmailed by the Black Hand or had unpaid loans. Some have pointed out that the mafia would not have left any survivors if that was the case. The most discussed suspect is a man named Joseph Momfrey, who ran a blackmail gang in town at the time. He was a career criminal, and some have said his time in and out of jail lined up with the attacks. Some have said the opposite, that he was in prison for many of them. There did seem to be a connection between at least Joseph Momfrey and Mike Pepitone. According to the crime writer Colin Wilson, Joseph Momfrey was shot to death in Los Angeles in December of 1920 by Esther Pepitone. According to Wilson, Esther claimed he was one of the men who had killed her husband, and when she told this to police, she received a lesser sentence for his murder. However, there seems to be no police or court records of any of this, so you may want to take that with a grain of salt.
The last theory from detectives at the time was that the Axeman was actually a vampire or a supernatural being. The letter to the newspaper made a pretty convincing argument that he was, in fact, a demon. So there were plenty of people that just took that theory and ran with it. They just couldn't believe one man could have pulled off these crimes so silently, often not waking victims. But we know from cases like the Golden State Killer and also from Ted Bundy, like I mentioned, humans just sleep much deeper than they care to admit, and it doesn't take a superpower to sneak up on us in our sleep. I'm sorry to point that out, and I hope that will not disturb your sleep tonight. I know it will disturb mine.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. I think that there's something especially spooky and, something that really sticks with you when there's like a supernatural element, although there's not necessarily a supernatural element, just the fact that the suspect, the assailant, took that angle makes the case all the more fascinating,
Right.
and makes it like creep into your brain at the worst times even more.
Absolutely.
There's so many like mystifying parts of
Yeah.
this. I'm like, if the mob and Italian grocers are so closely entwined, then that's an interesting mystery. There's also, I like the angle of that this is a publicity. The letter was a publicity stunt by a jazz musician,
Right.
which really makes sense for New Orleans to me. I'm like, it sounds like, someone would put them up to every person playing jazz music one night. Just
the letter to
have a
me
real
definitely
party.
seemed like a hoax. Like, I do think it's probably
Yeah.
somebody in like the jazz business who's like, I'm going to get some business
Yeah.
tonight. Like,
Yeah.
really gross joke,
Yeah.
but I get it.
Mhm.
I get why they would have done it. And also, I don't think people talked
All
about
this hype.
sensitivity and murder at the time. So I get it.
I think it just was such a runaway story, like it's like there could be 20 Axemen, there could be 0. It's like all such a mystery. So it's like I can understand people sort of getting really hyped up by this and really like entwined in
it's
it.
interesting. And like, had I had more time this week to do a deeper dive, like I really wanted to, like this raised a lot of questions for me. Like in other cities, how many murders or attempted murders? Because actually, I think it's interesting to point out that this is not like an efficient means of killing. Like a lot of the attacks,
Right.
most of the people survive, which is
I was just going to say,
good.
so many people survived.
Yeah. So also like if the mob was attacking people, that was one point that was raised. Why wouldn't they use a gun or like a more
They just shoot
like,
you.
sure
Yeah, exactly.
thing? Like this was clearly not like an efficient method. Thank goodness.
This was more of a game, obviously.
Right.
This is something that the assailant enjoyed doing. It wasn't just a
makes me
direct,
think
like,
that.
let's kill people.
And it would make me question, like in other cities, how many robberies were there where they were using a
How many
weapon of
axe
opportunity?
attacks were there?
Yeah, like around the world,
like
not just in New Orleans.
Yeah, it wasn't just New Orleans where everyone had an axe at this time, if that's how things were going. Like everyone all over the place had fireplaces and presumably axes.
Exactly.
Which is fascinating. I feel like there's very few axe attacks these days. And I feel like most people don't own an axe. And personally, I couldn't even tell you, like, obviously you go to a hardware store and buy an axe, but I don't know how much an axe is. Like I have had 0 encounters with an axe.
I have had very few.
And it's like when we did our Patreon special on the firemen's riot in Toronto sometime around this time or maybe earlier, that was a prominent thing there too, where it's like every fireman has an axe. And I know to this day they probably still do, but what is the purpose of that? I'm not so sure. It's just not so, it's not such a thing in our sort of society these days that like axes are just ubiquitous.
Like, thank goodness.
Yeah, because even though a lot of people survive, that is a really gruesome, like scary sort of attack.
Gosh, and like I think of poor Harriet, that she ended up like dying of meningitis, but before that she had lost like all the nerve sensation in her face, and she lost vision in an eye. And like what a terrible way to survive that attack. Just awful.
Yeah, horrifying. So what have you been watching this week?
I haven't really been watching anything true crimey, unfortunately. It was kind of like a chaotic week for me, and I was just watching Bling Empire because sometimes you just need a palate cleanser. It's like that's all I do now is palate cleansers from true crime. When I'm researching stories too, I think it's like I need more of a break from true crime than normal. It's like I can kind of get an overload. So Bling Empire, it's great.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, I was going to say, I think all our listeners could use the odd palate cleanser recommendation as well, because if they're binging a bunch of episodes and we've recommended several different spooky things to watch, and then they're like, wait, I need a moment to breathe here.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I heard about a good palate cleanser of the future that will be coming out.
Tell me.
That was announced. So have you heard of this show coming out called Big Mother?
No.
So it's like Big Brother, except it's all drag artists and RuPaul is the mother.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, I can't wait for that.
Okay, please remind me when that's out and when you're watching it, because
I will.
it might not be on my radar again, and that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I need that in my life.
It does sound perfect. It's like I don't have a lot of interest in Big Brother, especially now that those kinds of shows have been out for some time, but
thing.
This is the perfect combination.
Yeah,
so
great.
I'm into that one. And the only spooky thing that I can really say I've been watching this week, it's not true crimey at all, but it's kind of like a spooky science, is like, so it may be a Canadian show. I'm not sure whether all of you can get this or whether you can get this, Aurora, but there's a show on Netflix called We're All Gonna Die, Even Jay Baruchel. Jay Baruchel is an actor from Montreal, actually. And so he sort of walks through these potential situations that could be apocalyptic, like world-ending scenarios, like pandemics and meteors and yada, yada. And he talks about, in each episode, they sort of break down the potential way that some event could end our life, our world. And then at the end, they talk about the science that is probably going to fight that thing and prevent it from being an apocalypse and how we're going to get out of it. So I think it's very,
soothing.
It's got an uplifting angle at the end. Yeah. So
I do need that.
I like it. I've seen a few episodes. It's fun. Yeah. It's nice to be reassured when there's so many like near apocalyptic things happening in the world today.
And the way my anxiety works is like, I spend a lot of time thinking of the problem and not through a solution. And also I'm not a scientist, so I probably would not be able to identify
You're like,
those
what is the
solutions
solution?
anyway,
I don't even know.
Yeah, I love
so
that.
It's nice to be sort of consult with that.
Yes, amazing.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for this week. If you disagree, you can get your fill on murdermurder.news, where we post the latest in true crime news every day of the week.
You can also find us on Instagram at murdermurdernews, on Twitter at murdernews, on TikTok at murdermurdernews, and on Facebook, you can find our page by searching for Murder Murder News.
While you're on Facebook searching for Murder Murder News, you'll also see our little group pop up. We want to make sure you remember, if you need somewhere to post those gruesome articles and spooky memes where folks will actually appreciate them. And if you want in on our virtual book club. We're currently reading The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, and we'll meet to discuss the book on Zoom this Sunday, May 29th. And as always, everyone's welcome, and we're hoping to see some new faces this weekend.
What a great episode. I think we did all right. How about you? If you loved it so much, you want to write a review about it, or even just leave a 5-star rating, please do so now before you forget.
Have a great weekend.
Bye, friends.
Bye.